Today, I want to do something a little bit different by talking about the current crisis that we're in, this ongoing pandemic, in light of the story of the Good Shepherd, which you find in the Gospel of John, chapter 10. So, what you'll notice is that over the course of the story of the Good Shepherd, the Lord talks about himself and uses the analogy of the Good Shepherd to reveal kind of what he's like, the nature of his heart. And one of the first things he says right off the bat is that the Good Shepherd stays with the sheep. He doesn't leave. He's fully committed to the sheep, as opposed to the hired hand who basically takes off at the first sign of trouble. And what's implied here is that the Lord is obviously fully committed to us. He's fully committed to stay with us through our circumstances, thick or thin, for better, for worse, for richer or poorer, not unlike what we find in the marriage vows. But what's implied here also is that because the Lord is fully committed to us, so we too should be fully committed to him, in terms of not trying to look for some idealized life or some different life because we find this life to be kind of unexpectedly painful, but to fully trust and believe that God's work is powerfully at work in this life as opposed to some imaginary life which is otherwise known as not our life. And the thing I want to impress upon you is that when you have that mentality, again, this idea of not running away from your present life in favor of some life which is less painful or not so difficult, you realize all sorts of opportunities to cooperate with God's grace that perhaps you didn't recognize before. And this is something you find throughout the history of the Catholic Church. So whenever there's a sort of prolonged crisis, God raises up people and movements associated with these people to respond to the crisis at hand. And so, for example, in response to the Protestant Reformation, which you find, of course, in the 16th century, there was the Catholic Counter-Reformation, led by such people as Charles Borromeo, St. Ignatius of Loyola, St. Teresa of Avila, and St. John of the Cross. And funny enough, you find a similar thing happening in these kind of modern circumstances, this time of pandemic. And so, for example, people have known for the longest time that the church has needed to step up her game in terms of her online presence, to make her presence felt and to make her presence more attractive, to put it quite frankly. But even though we've known that, people haven't really done anything for the longest time, until recently. And so even looking at people in North America, so many Catholic groups and so many Catholic people have really tried to step up their game in terms of the online presence. Podcasts, live stream masses, online retreats, wherever the case may be. People are forcing themselves to be creative, to rise to the occasion, again, in response to the crisis at hand. And that's typically a very Catholic thing, finding opportunities for real creativity and strong initiative in response to particular crises that God calls us to face in the context of his divine providence. In any case, that's kind of the first thing. But the second thing is this. The Good Shepherd invites us to listen to his voice as opposed to any sort of competing voices. Now, the thing I want you to notice here is that when it comes to this notion of following the shepherd's voice or listening to the shepherd's voice, quite apart from kind of avoiding overt temptations to do evil things, like punch that guy in the face or rob this particular bank, you got to be attentive to issues of process. So the whole idea here is that when it comes to actions done by the human person, moral actions, the whole thing has to be good. So it can't simply be a matter of having a good intention or a good intended object. The whole process, again, has to be good. And so, for example, even when you look in your own life, I'm sure there are situations where you felt inclined to do good and noble things on the face of it, which have taken away from your ability to attend to those few things the Lord wants you to do carefully and well. And so, for example, maybe you've been in situations where you've worked so much that you don't have the mindset to read or to pray or to be present to God or people in your life, people like your family or your friends. I mean, certainly there are situations where we're called to move beyond our own comfort level, but at the same time, if you find yourself habitually pulled out of this natural rhythm to which God calls you to live your life, you got to kind of examine that. So that's a really subtle example where I have to be mindful of being attentive only to the voice of the Good Shepherd as opposed to other more kind of competing voices, if you will. In any case, the third thing I want to draw your attention to is this idea of the Good Shepherd laying down his life for his sheep in order that he might take it up again. So the whole idea is that people who are called to become disciples of the Lord, called to become other Christ in this world, we too are called to do the same. To die to ourselves, to die to the old Adam, if you will, and to be reborn multiple times over and over again, to renew our baptismal promises, to become other Christ in this world, which is no small thing. But you see what this means, kind of practically speaking, in terms of this ongoing crisis that we find ourselves right now, this ongoing pandemic. We need to ask ourselves in a certain sense, how is God calling me to, again, die to the old sinful self and be reborn in Christ? Or to put it more succinctly, what parts of my life is the Lord calling me to put to death, if you will, in favor of the new life that he's offering me? And so, for example, is he calling me to die to my pride, my ego, my sense of self-reliance, my fear of abandoning myself entirely to his providence? I mean, the possibilities are endless, but that's something perhaps you should pray into. How is God, again, calling me to die to the old sinful self, to be more fully reborn in his image? Now, certainly the common denominator with all these different things we've been talking about today is this notion of spiritual warfare. And I was trying to think of a way to kind of illustrate these different things in a way which was kind of interesting and unique and attractive. And the example that kept coming to mind was this movie called The New Mutants, which came out just recently. And basically, it's a spin-off of the X-Men films. And so as a bit of background, the X-Men movies, and by extension the New Mutants, are about these people who have different mutations which have given them basically superpowers. And the unique thing about the New Mutants property is that basically it tells the story of these mutants who again have superpowers, but the story is told in the context of the horror genre as opposed to the more classical superhero genre. Anyways, the thing I want to focus on, and this kind of ventures on spoiler territory, right? So be warned, right? Basically, the main character, Dani, she has the mutant ability to make people's fears real. So real that they can actually kill you. So that's her particular power. And at the end of the movie, she makes real her own particular fear, this demon bear, if you will. And so as a bit of background, Dani is a Native American, and at the very beginning of the movie, her father, before he died, told her the story about how within the heart of every person, there's basically two bears. A good bear, which represents everything which is good about the human person, and an evil bear, which, well, not so much, right? And when Dani asks her father which one wins, the father says to her very cryptically, the one that you feed. In any case, at the end of the movie, Dani has been knocked out because of various circumstances. And so her friends are basically fighting this huge, massive demon bear, funny enough, in the context of this church. And so they're using all their mutant powers to try to bring this bear down, and they're losing. Like, they're basically dying, right? Because it all rides on Dani. It's her fear. She's the one who has to face her fears and put this bear down. But again, she's unconscious. So then finally what happens is that Dani has this encounter with her father, funny enough, in the context of a dream. And the father says to her that she needs to get up and basically do what she needs to do. In response to which Dani says, I can't. It's too big, meaning like the bear's too big. In response to which the father says to her, you're bigger. And with that, Dani gets up and she faces this bear, which again is massive, huge bear, flames coming out of his eyes. And Dani faces this bear and says, no. The bear is still roaring up a storm. She says again, stop. And then the bear starts to calm down. And she holds firm, right? This little girl facing her fears, facing this huge, enormous bear, again with flames coming from his eyes, tells this bear to stop, to settle down, to quiet, whatever the case may be, right? And he does. And all of a sudden the bear gets smaller, and then eventually he fades into nothing, right? And I remember watching that scene a long time ago and just like bawling my eyes out, actually, because it's a great metaphor for the spiritual life. I mean, when it comes to spiritual battles, when it comes to spiritual warfare, the battle can be fierce, right? But you see, the thing you got to realize here is that in a certain sense, the devil's power to conquer your soul depends on him convincing you to give in to your fear. But the thing you got to realize, and this is kind of the point of the scene, no matter how much that bear is roaring in your heart, you remain in control. You remain in control. You can still choose whether or not to give in to your fear or to cling to the truth, to cling to the reality of the Good Shepherd, to listen only to the voice of the Shepherd, to the exclusion of other competing voices. And when you do that, when you have the courage and the wherewithal to cling and to be obedient only to that voice, again, to the exclusion of other competing voices, you will stay safe, and the Good Shepherd will lead you home. And may God bless you all.